Okay, so Neil Shubin is professor and associate dean of organismal biology and anatomy at the University of Chicago, and I believe also the provost of the Field Museum of Natural History. Among many other things, Shubin was elected to the National Academy of Sciences in 2011, but I know him mainly for his books, and probably most people know him for his books. He is the author of 3 books, which I found very, very intriguing. That's why I invited him. The latest one is Some Assembly Required. You can find a lot of reviews about this book. Previously, Your Inner Fish, which came out, I believe, about 10 years ago. And that was, I think that's the one that was chosen by the National Academy of Science as the best science book of the year. And I'm forgetting the third one, the Universe Within. The Universe Within. Good. Neil, it's all yours.
Thank you, Piero. Thank you for inviting me to this intellectual feast, and thanks to the audience for showing up. I'm going to show some slides.
I'm going to turn off my video so I give you maximum bandwidth, okay? But I'm still here.
Okay, thank you. So let me share some slides because I'm going to be showing a number of slides over the next 20 minutes. So what we're going to do today is to talk about Some Assembly Required, and really that's the title for a book I wrote. But what we're going to be focusing on are the great transitions in evolution. And how do they happen? How did multicellular life come about from single-celled organisms? How did creatures evolve to walk on land? How did creatures evolve to fly? These great events that have happened over billions of years of the history of Earth and life have really come to define our world and the biodiversity we see around us. And this has happened over the course of time through evolution and gradual changes. But it's logical to ask, how did these huge events happen? It seems like so unlikely, how animals, fish, which lived in the seas for millions of years, where life was in seas for billions of years before anything was on land. How did they take the first steps on land? When you think about it, it seems so impossible. So much has to change at once. Same thing is true with the origin of flight. And as I was beginning to think, as I was thinking about my book, I was actually reading about the autobiography of Lillian Hellman, just randomly. So I just like to read about people who have interesting lives, and Hellman had a very interesting life. She was blacklisted by the playwright, blacklisted by the House Un-American Activities Committee, lived a life of kind of no regrets, as you can see in this photo, which sort of summarizes it to some extent. But Hellman, in reviewing her life in her autobiography, had a quote which applied to her own life, but also I felt applied very nicely to understanding the great transitions in evolution, to biology and geology. And she said, in thinking about her own life, she said, nothing, of course, ever begins when you think it does. And really, when you think about history, and in particular biological and geological history, that is profoundly true. Because if you think just, our naive picture of evolution is one of obvious, sort of progress, where one stage leads to the next. If you think that lungs arose as creatures evolved to walk on land, or feathers evolved as creatures took flight, you'd be in very good company, but you'd also be entirely wrong. And we've known that for over a century. And it's truly remarkable. And because the story is that the inventions that sort of define the great transitions in the history of life typically appear before the revolution they're associated with. And indeed, evolution couldn't have happened any other way. And that's kind of what I want to explain. I'm going to take some very simple examples from my own research, just to give you, and others, to give you a sense of how this principle applies and how it sort of changes how we see the dynamics of the history of life. And so what I want to talk about is sort of one thing that I've been working on for the last number of decades, and that is the transition from fish to land-living animal, which you see here in this sort of cartoon. This cartoon was done for a textbook in the mid-1980s, and it shows a cartoon on the top of a fossil fish from about 390 million years old. On the bottom is a fossil limbed animal, a tetrapod, early land-living animal from rocks about 365 million years old. And you look at the endpoints of this transition and you think, well, so much has to change as you go from life in water to life on land. Creatures that live on land breathe, and locomote, and feed, and excrete, and reproduce in different ways than creatures that live in water. And when you think of the suite of inventions that are necessary for this to happen, You know, it almost seems impossible if that's the viewpoint you take. But the reality is evolution happens in very strange ways, in ways that actually make these kinds of transitions much more plausible. So what I want to do is to show you about how we approach this kind of thing, and then how we begin to think about how these inventions that are necessary for a revolution like this happen. So my quest actually as a scientist, I'm both a paleontologist and a molecular biologist. So we'll talk a little bit about the paleontology today. Because what I set off to do, soon after seeing this slide in graduate school in the 1980s, I set off to find an intermediate between life in water and life on land in the fossil record. And essentially I wanted to find a flat-headed fish with fins, with arm bones inside, something that serves as an amalgam of these traits, and something that would give us a sense of the dynamics of how this change happened. So to make a very long story short, we were looking for rocks of the right age to answer this question, rocks of the right type to hold the fossils that would answer this question, and then rocks that were exposed to the surface. And there are a number of places that were candidates, but one stood out for the quality of the rocks in all those categories I just gave you. And that is up in the Canadian Arctic, where the arrow is here. What you see is the arrow is pointing to Ellesmere Island, which is of Arctic Canada. And they're in a band stretching all the way east to west across Arctic Canada, are rocks of the right age to answer this question, about 375 million years old, rocks that were formed in ancient rivers and streams and tidal estuaries. And rocks, that if they're not covered by ice or tundra, they're exposed as bedrock, which are perfect to work on. So for a lot of reasons, this was an area that we decided to devote a lot of attention to. So what I'm going to show you is expeditions that happened over 6 years, because it took us 6 years to find what I'm going to show you. And we began our quests in different regions of the Arctic, but just to give you a sense, this is one of our field sites that we worked in 2000 in our second year up there, and it gives you a sense of what we do. We lead small expeditionary teams, so it's because it's very expensive to work there, and it's very remote. But what you see in the distance here across the fjord are a series of cliffs, and those are cliffs of rocks that were formed in ancient rivers and streams about 375 million years ago. And we know that through a lot of geological work that was done by oil and gas, actually, geologists working in the 1970s and 1980s. So we look at these, we're looking for bones that are weathering out on the surface of these rocks. And then, and we began to find over time, we were honing in on sites that would hold likely candidate fossils. We, ultimately, after about 5 years, we came upon this valley, and this valley was very special because it had rocks that were formed in the right age, again, 375 million years old, but these are rocks that were formed in small, tiny, gently flowing ancient rivers and streams, kind of perfect to hold skeletons of whole fossils. And actually, this is where we started to find skeletons of whole fossils. And so we worked, you can see in the middle of this slide, you can see there's a little divot in there. That divot no longer exists, we filled it in, but that turned out to be a layer that contained fossil skeletons of fish piled one on top of the other, hundreds of them actually. So our job then became to sort of remove these and to see what we can see and what does the fauna and flora look like, at this time that's captured inside the rocks. And working there, we found this, and this is kind of the big discovery. And what you can see here is the team, you see two people working on either side of what is a fossil inside the rocks. But if you look at the very tip of this, where my pointer is, what you can see is bone's the same color as the rock. I know you think I'm crazy, but you'll see in a second. I'm not, or not in this way at least. What you can see here is there's a bone the same color of the rock. You see this little V here? That little V is upside down skull. Those are jaw bones. There were teeth here. I had looking out at me when I saw this a fossil fish, because I could tell that by the texture of the bones. But it was not just any fish, it was a flat-headed fish. And you remember I said we're looking for a flat-headed animal of some kind. Well, it turns out we removed this, and you can see the arrow is pointing to what I'm showing you here. And again, you train your eye to these things. And if you were to work in my crew for a week or two, your eye would be trained to spot those bones immediately. These bones come home. We found about 20 of those specimens, not that year, but over a number of years. They come home to Chicago, where we work on them in the lab, and this is what happens. They're worked in the lab, somebody removes the rock grain by grain, and what you can see emerging, this is that specimen I was just showing you. This is after about 4 or 5 months of work. You can see it looks like the top of a skull. So you have sort of a top of a skull here. There's one eye hole in orbit. There's another eye hole in orbit there. Another few months go by, boom, it looks like we have a flat-headed creature with eyes on either side. Look further back, you can see, look, there's like some sort of shoulder there, another shoulder there, maybe there's even a neck, the fish has a neck. So basically we were looking for a flat-headed fish with fins with arm bones inside, maybe even with a neck or some combination of characters. And this is that specimen. This is what we found. This is Titalic Rosia, which is the critter that came out of there. If I was to hold it in front of you, you'd see a creature about, 1.5 meters long, scales in its back like a fish, fin webbing like a fish. You can see it here on the right. There's all kinds of other fishy characteristics to this, but it has a flat head with eyes on top, as well as other skull features related to land-living animals. It has a neck. No fish has a neck. This is obviously very tetrapod-like. And indeed, when we cracked open the fin, what do we find? We found bones that correspond to upper arm, forearm, even parts of a wrist and digits inside the fin. So it was kind of interesting that way. And to give you a sense, this is kind of the fin. It has a humerus, an upper arm bone. It has a radius and ulna, these two bones here, which are forearm bones. And then it has two wrist joints. And you can see on the left here, I drew them for you. In A is the shoulder joint of this creature. You can see the socket in the shoulder and the ball on the humerus. B is the elbow of this creature. And then there's two wrist joints, successively known as proximal and distal carpal. Well, that's interesting, but that's kind of leading to the main point. The main point is here we have a fish that we discovered in the fossil record, and there's others like it now that are known, that has fins with arm bones inside, has a neck. Those arm bones correspond to humerus, radius ulna, wrists, and even parts of digits. That is, antecedents, in fact, even features that creatures use to walk on land already were present in this creature, which is clearly an aquatic creature that had gills. Now you can ask the question, well, okay, so where does the suite of features come from? Okay, there's a fish with arm bones. There's a fish with a neck. What about lungs? Well, to talk about lungs, I'm going to tell you we've known about lungs in fish for over a century. And a lot of that work comes from this gentleman, Bashford Dean, who had two of the most interesting jobs on the planet. Simultaneously, he was curator of the medieval armor collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan. And at the same time, he was curator of fossil armored fish in the American Museum of Natural History across Central Park on Central Park West. And what he did as part of his job at the American Museum, working on fossil fish, is he noticed that there are a lot of fish that have lungs and gills. And not just any fish, but fish very closely related to us. So this is one of those types. They're alive today. And there are many known in the fossil record, but this is one creature that's alive today. That's a Neoceratodus, a lungfish. And as the name implies, they have both lungs and gills. And what they'll do is, as Gene noted, they'll go up and gulp air. And when the oxygen supply in the water gets low, they'll gulp air. So lungs are sort of an accessory organ in them. And these are not just random things. These are identical. Here's another species of lungfish. These are very similar to our own lungs. They have two lobes, they have alveoli, they have the same surfactant chemicals that hold the lung together. And indeed, when people looked at them genetically, versions of the same genes that form these lungs form our own. So these are lungs, right? And when you map this out, following Dean's work, here's a phylogenetic tree of tetrapods are on the right, you, me, reptiles, birds, and so forth. Lungfish are here, the next branch, then there are other ray fin fish and so forth. If you map out the presence of lungs, it turns out lungs are not some derived feature that came about as animals took their first steps on land. They're actually primitive. They actually arose in fish living in water, dealing with variable oxygen environments. And so fish had lungs well before animals took their first steps on land. So what does this mean? This means that arms and legs and necks and flat heads and presumably digits and lungs and many other features already existed in fish before they took their first steps on land. So the great inventions that were necessary for the great revolution from life in water to life on land already were there for fish living in aquatic ecosystems. And the big revolution was repurposing them for use in a new environment, right? And evolution couldn't have happened any other way because you would have had to wait for like the simultaneous invention of multiple adaptations. Well, here you got it because fish were already finding ways to adapt to water in ways that were convenient for later evolution on land. Let me, hold on a sec. And the same thing is true with birds, people, and so forth. Here's a mandarin duck. They have feathers, they have hollow bones, they're warm-blooded, and so forth. If you look at each one of those traits, whether it's feathers and so forth, we see them in dinosaurs. Hollow bones, feathers, wing-like structures, high metabolism, and so forth. The same story holds for different transitions. That's not just some random one-off. So really the great inventions of the history of life happened before the great revolutions they're associated with, and it's repurposing, not as much the evolution of new inventions that's exploring this new evolutionary space. It's using old inventions in new ways and new environments, repurposing. And that leads us, this whole thing applies also to our DNA, not just fossils and anatomy. And I want to give you a sense just to show how surprising it can be when we study DNA. And this will be where I close. I'm just going to talk for a couple more minutes. Every cell, all over 20 trillion cells in our bodies have about a 6-foot long strand of DNA packed inside the nucleus. That's an enormous amount of DNA, right? I mean, if you were to unravel all this DNA in our bodies, in one person's body, yours, mine, and put it end to end, it would run from here to basically to Pluto. So there's an enormous amount of biological computing power with the DNA and the proteins inside our cells that contain the information that's necessary to build bodies. And some of the inventions that happen result from interesting changes to our DNA. And I want to tell the story and close very briefly with this story from Jason Shepard, who's a neurobiologist at the University of Utah. And I love telling Jason's story because it shows the crazy ways and unexpected ways that inventions can happen in biological space. So Jason's not an evolutionary biologist, he's a neurobiologist, and he's very interested in memory. And he's interested in the genetic basis of memory. And if you're interested in that, there's one particular protein and gene complex that's very important, and that's ARC, A-R-C. Because mutations in mice that have this ARC, that have mutations in ARC, they have trouble with memory. They can learn behaviors, but they can't retain them from day to day. Likewise, people who have mutations in ARC have many cognitive deficits. So we were studying ARC, and he isolated the protein, and he sent me this slide. And he had, when he was studying them, he isolated the protein, and he popped it under a scanning electron microscope, and he found that the ARC protein formed these clumps. You can see these little circular clumps all throughout here. That's the ARC protein. It forms these clumps. And he said, I've seen these before. Oh my goodness. And so we called some colleagues over from the virology department at the University of Utah. Again, he's in a medical school. They came over and he didn't tell them what it was. And they said, what do you think this is? And they said, well, obviously these are clumps that were formed by the protein HIV, the virus that causes AIDS. He's like, no, sorry, that's ARC. It's a memory gene of mice. And so when they did the comparative biology of this, it turns out that ARC has viral sequences in it. And when you look at the distribution of the ARC gene, it leads to the hypothesis that at some time in the distant past, likely when fish invaded land, there was a viral invasion where this particular virus, not all viruses do this, but this particular virus invaded the DNA, and then it was repurposed to function as a memory gene over time. So this virus was, instead of causing an infection over time, it was domesticated to function in memory. So the trait of forming this clump, which helps HIV spread from cell to cell, they form these clumps and they can move from cell to cell, actually was repurposed for ARC to move from cell to cell in making memories. So this just goes to show you that nothing, of course, ever begins when you think it does. Nothing, of course, ever begins when you think it does. That the more we study evolution, the more we study genomes, the more we see that the inventions in the history of life have a different sort of origin than we can ever really suppose. And indeed, evolution cannot happen in any other way. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Neil. This was a great appetizer for the book, for all the books you wrote. I have several questions. Of course, reading the book, a lot of things came to mind. First of all, a practical question. Are there other fossils out there? Have we found other fossils that document the transition from sea to land in other places?
Yeah, it's really great. So since Titalic, there are others known. And so some of them are incredibly well preserved. There's one from Quebec called Alpistostegi. There's a few from Eastern Europe. There's another from Russia. There's a potential one from Australia. So it seems to be that there's a whole group of these creatures evolving around 380 to 375, maybe even older, million years ago. And the more you look, the more you find, I think. And yeah.
And so I know we are talking millions of years, but do you have a sense of what the chronology is? Was there one place where it happened and then it started happening in other places, or it happened, in multiple places?
Right, that's $1 million question. Yes, it's a great question because we as evolutionary biologists have a bias towards it happening in one place because our methods tend to show us that. But that may not necessarily be how things have happened, because the more we learn about genetics and the more we learn about adaptation, what you could see is that sometimes the same invention appears independently in different groups. It's just like in technology. Sometimes, the same technological invention can happen in different places in the world at the same time. Something's in the air. And that's something that's in the air in the biological and evolutionary sense. Maybe the environmental conditions are right. Maybe the genetic background for all the creatures that were evolving at this time was right. So what I'm giving you a very long answer to say, I don't know, but it's entirely plausible that it happened in multiple places simultaneously, despite the fact that most evolutionary biologists would tell you, man, no, it probably happened once.
And this time I was reading your new book, and the question came to mind, why? And then I Googled and found out, correct me if I'm wrong, 80% of the species on this planet live on Earth, on land now. And but there's plenty of water. Normally animals migrate when they run out of some key resource. There's plenty of water. Why would any animal move from sea to land? Have you asked yourself?
Yeah, it's useful. That's right. So that's a good question, and I think that's another very relevant question. Think about it this way. Let's take a time machine back to what the world looked like 375 million years ago. 375 million years ago, pretty much all the fish that lived at this time period were carnivorous. Herbivory was not really invented in large fish yet. So it was a fish eat fish world. And there were some big fish about 15 feet long. There were smaller fish that were armored, but pretty much everything was eating each other. And so if you compare water to land at this time, water was filled with competitors and predators, for creatures like Tiktaalik. The land at this time, plants had already invaded land. They beat us to it by tens of millions of years. Invertebrates, such as large insect-like forms, had already invaded land. They beat us, our ancestors, to it by millions of years. So you already had fairly lush and rich ecosystems on land, but what they were lacking were predators and competitors. So I like to think of it as sort of a push-pull. That is, you have any variation that creatures would have that would enable them to avoid that rough, competitive, and predatory environment, which was water at 375 million years ago, and allow them to get into that area where there are food sources without all those predators and competitors would be favored. And so what you had is this branch of the tree of life that had these fish that already had the inventions that enabled them to do that. So they were able to exploit that when the opportunity arose. So what I'm saying is the ecosystems that were around in the late Devonian period, which is what we call this time period, were very unique. There were some of the earliest freshwater ecosystems, and at this moment of time, they're pretty much all carnivores. So it was either get big, because big fish tend to eat little fish, get armor, which you see a lot, or get out and find a way to avoid the fray and find new resources. Turns out our distant ancestors probably did that third strategy.
Mm-hmm. And then a question about your work. First of all, did any other paleontologist look for fossil in the Canadian Arctic where you looked and they didn't see what you saw?
No, and here's the thing, nobody looked. And so what happened was, these sites were very well mapped and studied by Canadian petroleum geologists and professional geologists who did not have an interest in paleontology. As you can see from the slide I showed you, remember where that little V where we said, here's the fossil? It's actually pretty hard to see. You're not going to see it unless you're looking for it. It's one of those things you have to have a dedicated and train your eye to see it. And then once you train your eye to see it, you start to see them everywhere. But if you're just there to map rocks on a different purpose, you're probably going to miss a lot of it. That being said, and here's an interesting historical fact, some of the Norwegian explorers who overwintered in that area in like 1900s. This is people who took the Fram, which is a very famous exploration vessel, took Amundsen down to the South Pole and took Nansen to the farthest north. They overwintered in some of these fjords, over 120 years ago, and they found fish scales in the rocks. So, there were isolated discoveries, but nobody really had looked. And this is one of those things, you have to look for them. You know, you have to have a dedicated expedition to do it. That's not true with every paleontological place. Sometimes you have rocks where the bone is white and the rock is red. You can see it a mile away. Not in a place like this. This turned out to be really tricky. And that's one of the reasons why it took us 6 years of dedicated effort to find it. We didn't just follow them. We had to train our eyes and put up with a lot to really narrow the search.
And my final question, I know you don't study plants, but now that you have a sense of how animals evolved from sea to land, does that give you a sense of how plants moved to sea, from sea to land?
Yeah, the plant story, I think, is actually a little more complicated because in some ways, the first invasion of land was probably microbial forms. So they were already on the rocks and probably metabolizing the rocks. And then plants came on, and there was probably a different varieties of plants. Some of them were less were kind of versions of the aquatic plants that what they did is they had very simple root systems. But one of the things you see very early on is plants make their own environment. So what plants were doing is, well before our distant ancestors took to land, is their root systems were actually making soils. And soils were something new on Earth, because it wasn't until you had land plants that you truly had soils. And until you had soils, you couldn't have stable streams like you see today in California and Illinois and so forth, which are where soils stabilize the banks. Root congested soils stabilize the banks. So what I'm saying is the plants more obviously change the environment than animals do. So plants sort of they change the world. They change the topography. They change the geography in many ways. And they actually were fundamental parts of the changes to the ecosystems that were necessary for animals to invade land. So what I'm saying is that their transition was very complicated because it was partially dependent on microbes in ways which we don't fully understand yet. But also they changed the environment for themselves. By creating soil, they changed the world.
Yeah. I know you have to go. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I hope we can meet in person and continue this conversation. I would have so many more questions.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for including me in this intellectual feast. I appreciate it.
Okay, thank you, Neil.
Bye-bye.
Okay,